image of statistical construct, which is very much the case of that kind of pandemic approach with all that statistic data, instant updating online, and so on and so on. So, but Keti today would like to speak on a very specific rituals and tradition of mourning or grieving. So, and I guess through that particular activity, and especially its performative character, because mourning is always have that performative rituals. We know it from Antigone, so on. And I guess it unpack for us a whole array of different approaches. And I hope that today we can really delve into that very important issues. And thank you, Keti, for joining us. And I'll give you the floor so you can turn on your mic and I mute myself and will be slightly moderating after your talk with some questions, and I hope it will arrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dima. I'm really glad to see you, and thanks for invitation. And I would like to really greet everyone in this difficult situation, and let's hope that we shall overcome this condition. My talk was titled "On the Libidinal Motives of the Denied Mourning," and it was not so much about mourning. We discussed this in our conversation with Judith Butler back in April, but this time I would like to make more references to how we cannot suspend our libidinal economy, our libidinal habits, which are part and parcel of capitalist production and which somehow hamper us to exert this procedure of mourning and hamper us to produce certain sorts of suspensions that we could have produced. So just to start, when there were the first global lockdowns brought by the pandemic, the first idea was that this will somehow suspend consumption and certain kind of libidinally grounded desires and habits. And immediately there were numerous voices calling for an economy of basic need, of frugality, which has always been the core of the political economic systems of historical socialism. And we heard this voice from Franco Berardi, who was insisting that yes, we have a grave and absolutely catastrophic situation, but maybe this is the chance to launch the use value demonetized economy. Then we had the voice from Zizek, who was also claiming that maybe with the pandemic and with the seizure and suspension of all this expenditure and luxury economies, we have the chance to start the economy with flat basics and the economy of non-alienation. So the stance that was absolutely unimaginable for Zizek, because he was always claiming that alienation is not surpassable in capitalist conditions. But this time with the pandemic, he was claiming even this possibility. But with the second wave, we see that the suspension of capitalism's libidinal logic failed. And it failed not only on behalf of neoliberal governments and businesses, and we heard a very loud voices from libertarian businesses against governments, that they are forbidding development of economy. But at the same time, the voice of the libertarian businesses and the governments supporting the libertarian businesses were intersecting with the emancipatory critics, like, for instance, Paul Preciado, like Berlin rallies, the protests, who were this libertinist disobedience against the digital networking, the digital restrictions during the pandemic. So strangely, well, my attitude to the governmental policies was not that I am surprised by the restrictions. On the contrary, my approach was that there were never the logical and proper restrictions. And sadly, according to my observations, libertarian businessmen were somehow coinciding with the rhetoric of Protestant critique of non-governmental disobedience. It means that lockdowns were associated mostly with the restrictive regulations imposed by the authorities from above, but they were not envisaged as the tool to requalify the production and communication, the tool to reconstitute the general imaginaries about our needs, about the possibility to imagine the new economy, the new counter-capitalist economy of basic need, not basic income. And this was the idea launched very actively by Yanis Varoufakis, and he even made a short video claiming how can we, the public, the users of Google, of Amazon, can reclaim back our basic income, and that we own this basic income that is stolen from us. And his idea is this expanded capitalist communism where each user can evenly distribute these incomes that are accumulated with 1% of the owners. But my idea was basic need, which would reconstitute, refurbish the idea of welfare altogether. And this opportunity and this potentiality existed during the pandemic to be revisited, but somehow it did not happen. I connect, first of all, the impossibility to mourn, the inability for awe and modesty, inability for this eschatological mood during the pandemic with the inability to mourn, and I connect the inability to mourn and inability for eschatological dimension with the libidinal economy to which we are part and parcel, and we, despite our non-capitalist aspirations, are submerged into this capitalist economy prone to libidinal economy. And I will start from Möbius logic, from the ambivalent logic, which we see in all the theories of biopolitics, starting with Althusser, how this libidinal economy is formed. First of all, I want to say that desire and restriction are ambivalently connected. For example, Althusser's theory of subject, Butler's theory of gender composition, Foucault's theory of sexuality, all of these theories are proclaiming certain kind of libertarian, liberty-oriented desire, but this desire at the same time is formed due to certain sort of restriction. For example, with Althusser, subject is created when it is subjugated. This is the form and construction of interpellation. The same can be said about desire and libidinality. Without monitoring desire, you cannot forge the desire. The same with sexuality. Foucault showed us that sexuality is created by clinical surveillance. So it is due to clinical surveillance that we acquire the lexicons of sexual enjoyment. This Möbius ambivalence is exactly the logic that constructed our society of capitalist libidinal economy. I wanted always to somehow analyze how the clinical anti-humanist condition is constructed and how anti-humanist and clinical condition is treated as emancipatory. But at the same time, how this clinical body remains to be libidinal body of enjoyment and desire. And I will try to somehow account for this very paradoxic situation. So one of the best critical texts to observe how this ambivalence and Möbius logic is operating is to look at the Psychic Life of Power by Judith Butler, where she shows that, okay, the controlled, surveyed body wants certain percentage of freedom. So how should we deprive ourselves from the control and surveillance of apparatuses so that the body remains this minimal, but still this minimal, freed, subverted body that can resist the apparatuses. And when she tries to find this minimal remainder of the free body that would be without subjugation and without restriction, she discovers the solitary body of a melancholic individual, which um, uh, remains solitary due to the initial loss of the other, initial loss of the social. The other is lost because generally the sociality is negative. And what remains with this minimal gendered free body is the narcissistic internalization of the loss of the other. So this is the free, subversive, resistant body, but this is a clinical body at the same time, the clinical body that is only confined to its own reflexes, to its own biological essentials, and its political pathos is exactly this solitary condition of its own sexual paroxysms, convulsions, and affectivities. And of course, this observation is inherited by Butler from Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, because Mourning and Melancholia by Freud was the conceptual text that, along with Foucault, influenced her argumentation. And what is the main standpoint of Freud? The red thread of this text is that, unlike mourning, which succeeds in bidding farewell to the loved and dead object, a melancholy fails to acknowledge the loss. In the melancholy, the existence of the lost object is prolonged. Melancholy internalizes this lost object and sometimes identifies this object with the ego. And in Freud's wording, in melancholy, the libido does not displace on another object, but is withdrawn, internalized into the ego, so that libido regresses into the ego. And precisely this regression of the desire, not towards another person, but towards the internalized other, which is now my own self, we see the attachment to the self. So this melancholic individual, this melancholic subjectivity forbids the existence of the other as the subject, but keeps the place of the other empty, so that this empty space of the other is internalized into the self. And then the whole operations and the whole relationships is taking place as with the self. So the melancholic is treating the other as if it were the self. Therefore, the narcissistic regimes of libidinality construct actually the logic of the capitalist libidinality. In other words, the question is, how can melancholic indifference to the other reveal itself libidinally as the urge, as desire, as enjoyment, and embody itself in politeconomic terms, in consumption and production. So this self-referential libidinal subjectivity is the subject of consumption and production. This was the already not stated in Freud, not stated in Butler, but already stated in Jean-François Lyotard. Thus, what is really important is to understand how this melancholic subject that is somehow castrated by the impossibility to love the other, this libidinal hunt develops. And Freud is saying that very often this melancholic suppression of the love to the other turns into mania, into maniacal hunt towards the object. And I quote Freud here: the manic subject demonstrates his liberation from object, causing suffering, causing lack, by seeking as hungry for a new object cathexis. So very often, as the result of this internalization of the impossible love of the lost object, we see the illusory hunt for the surplus of object, the hunt for the libidinal seductiveness and attractivity. And what is this hunt for the seductiveness and attractivity if not the commodity? And I think actually John Roberts in his latest book, which has not yet been published, on capitalist desire, is very precisely determining the logic of capitalism as the logic of self-love. He says that nobody would ever claim, especially among the critical subjects, that we love capitalism, but capitalism exists because libidinal economy triggers self-love. So not that we love capitalism, but capitalism exists and operates because we practice self-love. So we are these subjects with the lost other, unable to stage the drama of loving the other. And I think one of the very uncanny examples to show this hunt and this hungriness for the libidinal surplus constantly is Nymphomaniac by Lars von Trier. And we have here the formula, absolute formula in Nymphomaniac, if you remember this film: inability to love, inability to acknowledge this inability, because the melancholic not only is unable to love, but melancholic is even unable to acknowledge that she or he is unable to love. And as the result of these two inabilities, endless hungry hunt for consumption of object. And in this case, whether it is hunt for commodity object or sexual object, it makes no difference, because the logic is that you are devouring certain kind of commodities without any need or any possibility of saturation and any possibility of satisfaction. And thus, this body is the clinical body, and this body is the melancholic body, but at the same time, it is precisely this body that was also organized as the biomolecular body, free from all types of control. And now I shift to Preciado's text, which is full of contradictions from my point of view, because on the one hand, he is criticizing the biomolecular control and digital control of surveillance of the governmental constructions. And in this text, we come across a very acute and poignant critique of certain kind of dehumanizing technologies, or biologization of the body, which ends up with the human condition, as well as technocratic, techno-cybernetization of the body, which also ends the human condition. But my question to this text and to this critique is, but were not the post-philosophies, were not the emancipatory forms of critique the pioneers of this dehumanization? So were not the texts like Donna Haraway's Cyber Manifesto or Bruno Latour's critique of Western modernity, or lots of texts calling for biophysical attitude and biophysical critique of humanities, were not they the pioneers to install this absolutely biologized clinical body, quite ahead of the governmental policies that we come across today? So wasn't it that it was we, the critical subjects, that we first constructed this dehumanized clinical body, which is at the same time libidinal body, thinking that this would be our new body of emancipation, because this would be a mutated gender, mutated mutated cyborg. This would not be anymore the body of European metaphysics, the body of the ontological universalism. So it was our fault that we launched this dissection and hybridization and biotechno cyborgization of this body. So therefore, my question is, isn't it strange that precisely those who now decry biotechnological proliferation and biomolecular surveillance would support transhumanization, post-human cybernetic dissociations, and blurring of human condition? And we know that blurring of human condition, both by means of technique and by means of biomolecular positivism, was part and parcel of decolonial critique, decolonial emancipation, queer emancipation, and many other post-philosophic theories. Therefore, probably we had to be aware that that the end of critique of humanities, because we were, I think we ourselves were very much launching this total trading of natural sciences, technosciences into the humanities to finalize metaphysics, to finalize the whole concept of the human, in favor of cyberpharmacoclinic and biomolecular essences. And we ourselves aestheticized and eroticized the clinic, so that it were not simply the heterotopic zone of control, but even if you come across the Testo Junkie Manifesto by Preciado, you see this, desired anarchic libertinage. And this image of anarchy, precisely for Preciado, is constructed by dissected, perturbated, absolutely biomolecular, clinical body and biologized body. So the question is, when we blame the government in what do we blame it? What is emancipatory for us? Transhumanist condition or humanist condition? The whole body or this dissected, biologized body? And what is then the government? When is the government and the state bad? When it is anthropocentrist, because we were blaming it in being anthropocentrist, or when it is dehumanizing us, when we blame that it is surveying us by means of biotechnologies. Thus, we definitely are in this kind of controversy and contradiction. And we truly have to decide at the same time what suppresses emancipation. Because we ourselves, in the whole course of our critique since the 60s, could not decide what suppresses emancipation. Is it basic need and common good and ethical modesty? Okay, I personally choose basic need, common good, ethical modesty. Or on the contrary, what is emancipatory is excessive libidinal freedom. And these were the people who made 14th Documenta, surplus enjoyment and libertinage, who were saying, oh, government is forbidding us to exert this libertinage. Thus, we came during this pandemic into the total mutation and fusion of these discourses of emancipation. And this is why we encounter such a confusion within not only this text, which is a brilliant text by Preciado, but many other texts in contemporary cyberfeminism, xenofeminism, new materialism, and post-philosophic studies. And I will end by the example, which is for me a very beautiful example from an absolutely brilliant book by André Lepecki, which is called Exhausting Dance. And I think all the critics and practitioners of performance know this book because it became a programmatic book. In this book, André Lepecki is criticizing European modernity and precisely this dramatic, tragic European body, precisely this subjectivity that is able to mourn. And I will try to very quickly quote for you this his disposition. The way the clinical dimension intersects with libidinality is very vivid in contemporary dance, post-dramatic theater. The philosophy of such solipsist, clinical, and desocialized body was excellently described by Andrea Lepecki, and for him, the choreographic body of the dramatic Western modernity was a colonial body. It could only represent repression in its artificially composed beauty of the moment, in the eventality and kinetic temporality. So for Lepecki, dramatic, tragic, mourning subjectivity, which produces event and kinesis, is bad, is colonial. But this was precisely the body that was able to mourn. Whereas the post-choreographic, post-dramatic body, which André Lepecki is supporting, advocates for the anti-kinetic, solipsist duration of biological organism in total presence, in total Dasein of its duration. Such body is narcissist, solipsist, unable to love, mourn, or sacrifice. And the very, very, very last thing, the scale somehow, or the ethical imaginary that I was imagining during this constant arguments between one standpoint, another standpoint, that Dmitry was accounting for me was Derrida's term. Derrida is the author of the book which he wrote in 1989, and this book is called Circumfession. This term is the mutation of two words, confession and circumcision. And you know what is circumcision, right? It was written after the death of his mother. And in this book, the whole argument becomes the long procedure of mourning in the form of the confession of his love to his deceased mother. And the intonation of confession presupposes circumcision of all previous modes of living in the name of this certain event of losing his mother and certain understanding of what happened. So it is very important that circumcision is not castration. And it is the ethical act of retention of libidinality. But if castration is treated as restrictive termination of desire and castration is not able to stop libidinality, circumcision is a qualitatively and ethically different act. It suspends the regime of the libidinal, not out of prohibition, but the suspension of the libidinal in circumcision is caused by the event that changes being universally, retranslating it into the new dimension in which numerous previous habits, desires, taken as normal before, disappear or are suspended.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really, really, my brain are boiling. So, but we know each other, and actually I'm very much in your line in supporting this kind of serious and really radical critique of recent tendencies, and very much share how you describe this trap when on one hand the whole intellectual milieu was actually contributing to that kind of post-human or transhuman or whatever biomolecular transformation of humanity. And right now, during pandemic, we'll see how it starts to be contradictory in itself. So, and the basic possibility of commonality, of living together. So right now we speak more and more, I mean, who are we here? But at the same time, we know that actually that recent and permanent speculation about how we live with unhuman bodies, with different agencies, non-human agencies, and so on, come together with impossibility to continue that decent human life, like you said, that I'm for basic needs and common goods, first of all, and what we are actually losing now. And actually, I hope we can gather some questions that it not be solipsistic discussion between us, and especially not much to discuss because I'm very much sharing your position. I would like people maybe concentrate. You can drop a question into chat, but better if you raise your hands and just to speak out, it will be much nicer. But I would like to bring in attention to the event which happened few days before, as I mentioned, at 11th Berlin Biennale, under the title The Power of Mourning, Decolonial Struggles and Queer Bodies. Actually, I can even maybe share my screen. I think it's somehow open on my screen. Just a second. Just a second. It somewhere should be here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Strange, I can't see it here, maybe because I have two screens. Anyway, I can just maybe read some statements, because actually what most of your references you would imagine immediately in contemporary academia would be criticized for making mostly Western references. And the event, which was held by Berlin Biennial, was actually mostly let's say, non-European artists or artists from Latin America, because it was the whole focus of Biennial on Latin America. There was Carlos Mota, whom you might know well. So he made very beautiful performance, how one performer, actually you can watch it online. I sent it a link in our chat, the first one. So it was actually the beautiful queer body embodied on the stage, different mimics of the devil, how it was depicted on different pictures, and the pictures was spread around the space, was very beautiful, and a few more indigenous stuff. So, but they told that we do now aims to move away from Western philosophy. I'm quoting, so I'm reading this text, and cultural theory understanding of death and mourning. It emphasized themes of death, mourning, and life after death from a queer perspective, using critique of norms, question ontologies, epistemologies, and ethics. Taking into consideration, and here I remember we start very interesting chat, and I hope you can really talk about it more. Taking into consideration that for indigenous people, death has been life silent companion. Since the start of colonial conquest, this artistic intervention attempt to critique discourse on death and mourning associated with heteronormative models of familiar bonds, chronological lifestyles, norm for intergenerational relationship, and adequate responses to biopolitical regime of health and life. So here we'll see that can actually imposing that kind of contradiction between indigenous way and so-called Western. And let me finish it just one more sentence. And they delve this practice into cultural ties that indigenous people have maintained in their understanding of mourning as a form of both cultural expression and struggle. And in this sense, broaden the spectrum of sexo-dissident struggle, so that connection between sexo-dissident kind of queer practices and indigeneity in different forms, understood as the bodies that are battleground and decolonial resistance beyond their mortality. Would you comment on that? Because I remember you were quite skeptical about that kind of Western implementation of certain indigeneity and how
Well, first of
in
all,
relation to mourning.
I first have to watch it, and well, it would be really interesting to watch it. But I immediately have questions when we have in the Western institution, in the midst of Berlin, we have the somehow protocols about indigenous life. Where are these people? Are they in Berlin? If they are in Berlin, they are not indigenous anymore. If you go,
No, that actually came one performer from Mexico, actually with kind of, I don't know exactly.
I mean, I treat it as the speculation with the idea of the indigenous, because, I mean, since 50 years, there is no pure indigenous as such, you know. I come from Georgian Western part where mourning was the whole ritual, and I would never call it indigenous, although it was inheriting very, very ancient tradition of kolchida and etc. But you know, if you it is very wrong to say that indigenous tradition is what, more tragic or less tragic, because if you take the Western Greek tragedy, it is also indigenous, you know, in its attempt to transfer from the theological to the political society. So what is the idea of this a tragedy that we come across generally in the procedure of mourning? is the, first of all, the tradition of the tragedy is the farewell to the absolute theocratic, in favor of the civic and political. And the question is, when we come across certain sort of cultures that are indigenous, what do we like there? What do we call for there? Why do we want this indigenous condition? Because it is not Western. If the only reason why we are apologetic is that it is not Western, then we are the best colonizers. You know, precisely because we like it, because it's not Western. But when I remember, for instance, old Mingrelian rituals, the very essence in them was this transition from the dark forces into the light forces, from some kind of decadence, from this theological submergence into grief, because grief can kill you, and you can aestheticize grief, but then you can stand up over your grief and make the mourning, make the theater out of it, make some kind of political act out of it, like Antigone. So Antigone could become some kind of witch, which is sitting and crying there. But no, she's politicizing this indigenous act. She's politicizing this indigenous tradition, bringing it to the political dimension. And this is why it becomes a tragedy. So I think this juxtaposition of indigenous and non-Western and cultural and unable to mourn and Western, this would be really stupid. I think the division between capacity to mourn and incapacity to mourn is not between indigenous and Western, but it is within the ethics of ethics of the body, and it is much more conditioned by, as I said, whether we are confined in our bare body, bare life, or some bigger ideation. I didn't use this word. What is important is ideation. Any culture, even absolutely indigenous culture, has this universalist dimension and ideation. Be it African, be it Indian, be it Latin American, without ideation, there is no language. And as soon as you have language, then you have the idea of the common good, the idea of love, the idea of universal mythology, and the idea of the poesis of the universum. As soon as you have the idea of poesis of universum, or of universality, then you are generating how to deal with the body, how to deal with your interest. Will it be a common interest, or it will be absolutely self-reflexive and solipsistic and selfish interest?
Thank you. Yeah, but I guess also that also bring dimension of that another type of living together. So that certain type we maybe sometimes idealize that exactly maybe in a way what you said about that kind of narcissistic, melancholic subject. In indigeneity, we have example of different forms of life. And maybe this is the point how we try to maybe learn or try to get into that kind of experiences which we are deprived from.
Yes.
And this is exactly that kind of nostalgic feeling for another type of communities which still, because I absolutely agree, because actually, you know, we work quite seriously in Chiapas, and actually for us, the access to Zapatism, because it was a mixture of that kind of political dimension of Marxism and local, that indigenous kind of cosmogony, which actually completely different. Without it, I would say that's why Zapatism so I would say, accessible for us. We have equal right to be inside this kind of realm, you know, of political ideas and different type of even tools how we really reclaim our commonality of living together. So yeah, and actually I would really recommend, because actually one performance which I saw today was exactly like you explained about that Miguelian tradition, how you come from dark to the light side through the act of mourning, and it was played by
I'm absolutely sure, but I would not make this juxtaposition. Mm, uh, I would criticize the melancholic body, but the Western tradition has both bodies, you
yes.
know,
Mhm.
as well as any indigenous tradition would have both bodies. So
Mhm.
for me, this is the
This
difference,
is-
and not that,
mm,
yeah.
sure. Any question? I don't see actually any question in chat. Maybe Gabriela, if you could help me, if you watch something, just let us know. But at the same time, you can also raise your hands if you'd like to ask something. Any questions yet ready, or you still digest, trying to understand what it was about? Maybe John, it's John with us. John, do you want to say something? No? Okay. But at the same time, I would suggest maybe what would be your, like, not a fortune teller, but how you imagine, like you asked me when we start to warm up and chat, what is the way out, Dmitry, what you hope, and actually what means for you in this very severe condition of state of exception, exceptional condition to stay human, and why we need, maybe actually, I absolutely agree with your critique on the dehumanization of our life, which actually kind of materialized in situation of pandemic and social distancing and everything, when we see collapse of certain social life. But what would be your vision up
Uh,
to peak? Yeah.
well, um, I don't know. I'm perplexed, as all people all over the world perplexed in the situation when we have no capacity for prognosis, and we cannot plan, and we cannot imagine these new commonalities, because how to imagine commonality when we have to obey and comply with certain kind of inevitable restrictions and our inabilities. But I ended with this idea of the eschatology. You know, when the
Mhm.
pandemic started, for me, this was some kind of, you know, a little bit theological situation, when as if the new I appeared, you know, like this possibility of the new I on in your consciousness, like you could have seen certain things that were absolutely invisible before, and it is due to the catastrophe. And you know that this terrible, well, what happens to the Oedipus is also terrible pandemic, which is the end of some kind of violation, you know. So um, what was the first ruminations with the pandemic is that there had been some sort of violations, be it political, be it ethical, be it social, be it ecological, for which we get this absolutely new catastrophic situation. But this new catastrophic situation opens up certain kind of recession, like circumcision, and within this circumcision, within this retention, you can see something new, some new possibility. And I was precisely describing this kind of a little bit monastic traditions of recession. And interestingly, I was thinking about how Foucault is describing care. You know, everyone is discussing care today, and care, it's interesting that it was also discussed only in clinical context, like we are transforming hospitals into we are transforming art institutions into hospitals, but at the same time care was discussed in some sort of charity, some sort of philanthropic terms. But if you look how Foucault is describing care, he calls it the practice of anachorets. What is anachoret? Anachoreti. The practice of anachorets is when the polis is dissected. You know, when the philosophers who were taking part in polis, and when the polis is demolished and decomposed, these are the people who want to keep their ethics and morals of the common good within themselves and go on with the practice. So they have to somehow circumcise all these possibilities, and definitely, generally, it was also about circumcision of pleasures and circumcision of all those enjoyments that, as they claim, people like Epictetus or Seneca, that demolished polis. So again, you have this juxtaposition of this excessive indulgence in pleasures and certain kind of common good, and common good demands from us this care to reclaim the idea of the basics. And so care is not about like simply medical care, but it's very much the ethical and politically philosophic care. And I think that this eschatology could have been the chance. And what was my pathos is that we did not use this chance with the pandemic.
But can I ask a quick question? Because you always kind of separate what you said, common goods and pleasure. Is it possibility that they rejoin each other? Do you imagine that basic needs and common goods can come with the pleasure, and what kind of pleasure it would be? Maybe it will be kind of different pleasure, as I would imagine, you know?
Yes, in my book, I was trying to inspect the non-libidinal construction of joy, non-libidinal forms of eros, because I would not talk about any forms of cutting the possibility of eros, but the pleasures that I'm describing is certain sort of dependencies and certain sort of rather addictions, because in capitalist context you see that commodity fetishism, that pleasure, joy, entertainment, consumption is certain sort of addiction that you cannot stop. And even our imaginaries about emancipatory liberties and pleasures, we have to check whether they are this type of addictions and entertainments, or whether they are the forms of certain kind of eros, of common eros, and of certain kinds of joy. So today we cannot speak about non-capitalist condition because we never had this non-capitalist condition. But if you look at what Foucault is describing, he definitely inspects sexuality in this work. And he connects this absolute indulgence in your own pleasure as some kind of end of philosophic potentiality. And it is clear in the ancient tradition and in the practices of ancient thinkers, in the Stoicist thinkers. And he brings the examples of the Stoicist thinkers. And what is Stoicism if not this idea, this idea of common good? Yeah.
I see. Thank you. So we have it was a question from Anna. What Foucault work you were talking about right now?
Yes, I'm writing.
Keti is answering. So guys, actually would be great if you could join. Maybe you already have enough.
Or maybe critique or critical commentary.
Yes, because I imagine that actually it can be quite different positions. Yeah. So, and not necessary, because I'm also feel that actually this line, which also partly, I don't know, maybe I ask you, actually, we just run big seminar, the casus of Agamben in our school. And maybe would you comment on his, was it you agree or disagree or you support? Because, you know, Agamben really polarized so many intellectual milieu, and even as I mentioned before we start to chat, actually it was yesterday big sending on Arte on solidarity, and actually it was asked many people, yeah, mostly in Germany, but Agamben was quite for them kind of the voice of dissidency. So he actually said that there is no space for solidarity, and pandemic actually destroy whatever we imagine and our communities and so on. Yeah, of course he spoke much more, but would be nice to hear your comment.
Well, Agamben's position is very interesting, and he inherits the Foucauldian critique of the apparatuses and Foucauldian critique of the surveyed of the governmentality that surveys the bodies. But I would say that Foucault is also inheriting the Benjaminian critique. So if so both of them, Preciado is claiming that if you read the text by Preciado, what is the ending of this text, right? Let's totally get rid of all digitization. Let's throw away our phones. Let's go into the street for the sake of this body affectivity, body collectivity. What is Bifo Berardi saying? Let's be together for only body collectivity, only body eros, only political eros can save us. And what is Agamben saying is also in certain sense, like we don't want to comply with this fear about pandemic. We want to be like Antigone, we want to bury our deceased brothers and sisters. Well, conceptually and ethically, of course, I agree with this, but for me, the difference is quite explicit here, because I think that if Bifo and Preciado have this anarchic ideal of certain kind of libertinist freedom. Actually, whatever, often you find this in their text, you know, this post-68 idea of liberties. Agamben is talking about certain, well, other things, because what Agamben is saying very important things in terms of questioning normalities and mere life. So what was the difference for me is that even when they criticize surveillance, both Bifo and Preciado, they remain in this condition of the normal. We want back to the normal. We want back to mere life, like very simple things of our friendships. Generally, this idea of the emancipated middle classes and emancipated mere life. But Agamben is talking much more about certain kind of extreme condition and Benjaminian idea of the divine, of the circumcised, of like theater of cruelty. So what is Agamben claiming? That we have the right to die. So I am choosing my right to sacrifice or to die. So Agamben wants to keep this right of extreme ethical act. So and his passion is about the possibility for this extreme ethical act, like the act of a priest who has to accept confession from a dying person, but he is forbidden to take this confession. So he uses this very extreme ethical dispositions, and I don't see these ideal callings for the collective brotherhood or whatever in his texts. He's much more talking about this condition of the divine, divine in symbolic sense, not religious sense, that we have from Benjamin, when Benjamin talks not of mere life, but of certain kind of the шкала, как сказать, scale. Scale of the divinity and scale of the cruel. And the scale of the cruel you see in the myth of Oedipus, because it is precisely when Oedipus is blinded, when he is able to see the truth and the true condition. So I think that in terms of ethical acts and ethical gestures, these are different acts of gestures. In the first case, we have democratic anarchic gesture. In the second case, we have aristocratic exceptional right for the extreme ethical act.
Thank you. Here comes first question. Olga, floor is yours. I can yeah, you can speak. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, everyone.
New York, yes?
Yeah, New York. I just voted, by the way.
Wow, cool.
I did it earlier than I expected. Anyway, I was struck, Keti, by your critique of Preciado when you drew the line between the human body and clinical body. So that the human body is a body as a whole, and the clinical body is a dissected body, right? So, and that they are not really kind of together, right? So that in the critique of the government and the critique of that, there is very hard to take a position, to understand from what point of position of which body we kind of like do this critique, right? So I was quite interested in this thought and in relation to Preciado, and I was thinking that, have you ever tried to draw a comparison between AIDS epidemics or pandemics? I don't remember how we call it, and the COVID. Because during the AIDS, the gay men, they managed to organize and they managed to actually kind of reconstruct this whole body by using the clinical bodies, right? So the bodies which were already treated and experimented upon, right? Because there were a lot of experimental drugs that was tried on them, and it's like horrendous stories. It's also because many of them had to choose between like getting blind and dying. Like, what do they actually would choose? And they had to make these horrible choices. And then they managed to succeed in terms of like creating the movement, right? The protest movement that actually shook the country and completely reconsidered this whole, reformed this whole kind of medical care and experimental and accessibility of experimental drugs, right, in the United States. And yeah, there was like a lot of things were accomplished actually because of it. And I also remember as a curator, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm familiar with the discussion around biopolitics, and of course, but it doesn't mean that I can't say anything stupid, right? No, but as a curator, I remember this images of dying gay men that entered the museums and biennials, right? So, and they were like demonstrating this clinical kind of dissected body, dying body, but at the same time, somehow it was woven into the whole kind of the movement, right? So the ACT UP movement and the organized social body. So I was wondering if there is a, are you saying that the death can bridge the rift between human body and clinical body if death is taken to this kind of new level, and I would say aesthetic level also, but it's not just aesthetic level, but also level of symbolic, right? So they're more like symbolism of the death here, helping to bridge their, this gap between the human body and clinical body.
Well, really very good question. I mean, definitely clinical bodies will ever exist because every human being is a clinical body at some point when we need treatment. But this was the point of also Agamben, that it is in the clinic that you are a bare, that you are experiencing bare life. So the fact that someone is destined to find oneself in the clinic is not an imaginary that has to be desired, but it is an inevitable condition that needs certain kind of treatment. But what we come across in the way Butler was treating it was that why you are telling these examples, that the clinical body became some kind of symbol of precisely what I was describing, that it was aestheticized to the extent that instead of getting rid of this clinical dimension and getting out of the clinic, because everyone wants to achieve convalescence and recovery, right? This clinical condition is aestheticized and politicized somehow as this remainder of the feeble body that can demonstrate its own feebleness and use this as some kind of subversive arena. And at some point, what we saw in the since performance art since 60s was very much this confinement of the body to this dismembered or mutilated bodies. Sometimes the bodies were deliberately mutilated, and you know this as a curator, to become clinical, whereas they were not clinical. So in performance, we see these mutilated, clinicized bodies without these bodies being clinical at all. So I'm not saying, I'm not censuring this or I'm not criticizing this condition, but I'm just diagnosing that the clinical body started, the clinical body with all its biological essentials, and the group of these clinicized solipsist bodies became the new sociality of emancipation. And this was what I came across at Documenta 14th, like there are no other bodies but this. So to become a political body and to become a political subject, it means that I have to go to clinic. I have to undergo this kind of interface. I have to represent this kind of clinical interface to become political. So this is the problem. Not that we shouldn't politicize the bodies that happen to be clinical by their fate and by their biography, but that we, without being clinical, are only politicizing the clinical condition and the biomolecular condition. And this is happening in well, in the critique of metaphysics, starting with Foucault, Deleuze, and all through Derrida. Well, I could talk about it, but well, I don't know whether I answered your question.
Yes, it's actually quite clear now. But I could also extend it to death.
Yes,
right?
please. It was very interesting, please.
Yeah, in order to become political body, so this body has to die. I mean, in terms of or demonstrate the dying kind of. This is what was happening with the during the AIDS pandemic.
Yes.
I actually, Olga, thanks for bringing into our discussions that AIDS and ACT UP. I would like to show one image which you definitely recognize. Oh, just a moment. It's from General Idea.
Yeah.
You know, of course, which I have in mind. Oh, where it is? Oh, shit. I don't know what happened. Just a second. Oh, I use two screens and this is really just a moment. Yeah, I think I got it. You see now?
Yeah, it's exactly what I meant. Yeah.
And actually, my thesis would be that actually during ACT UP and actually first wave of AIDS pandemic or epidemic, actually, I think they use very much that possibility of mourning and grieving and use that kind of dead bodies when they brought dead bodies to the White House and so on. I guess it was completely different situation, and their relation to the bodies was actually would be very interesting. I've never read any kind of proper analysis like comparative studies, what artists did during that time. But my hypothesis would be that actually those moments, this community was really politicized through direct danger. When you see when your old friends are dying every day, and you're already infected, that was something which transformed into incredibly powerful image, because that image from General Idea, that the comrade in the deathbed, it was really became kind of icon, and it actually has that certain kind of spiritual image. So I don't know if I'm right, but at the same time would be, I'm sure that people will deal with this topic more. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Olga. So, any more questions, or we have to maybe return to our life and get out of that screens? Yeah. Ruslan sent very powerful quote from recent Agamben. I really recommend to listen. And also I agree with you, because when you explain that position of anachorets, when all kind of social polis fall apart, there are some people who keep certain messages, kind of messenger. And actually, I feel like Agamben is also actually his activity. You know, I was always not so much familiar with his classical writing, but at the same time, I was always impressed that the most radical activists in Europe, like Tikkun or some people like around Clairefontaine was actually mostly his students, you know, and was quite surprised because I thought for me it was too metaphysical, kind of theological speculation, but at the same time during pandemic you really produce that kind of permanent messaging people about that something wrong in the world, and it really take kind of a figure from ancient tragedy right now because no one listened. And actually the quote which Ruslan shared with us, it's about that. Anyway, so if no more comments, I think, and people are really tiring of Zoom and all that presence, you work a lot on Zoom, I imagine. So maybe then we can really finish, and I have to thank to everyone, and I hope we'll be back, and please follow our School of Mutation. It will be new iteration this week. Yes, Gabriela, we have something to promote. Yeah. Would you like to say about next? It was Racing
Yeah,
Cat.
I just wanted to thank you, Katie, because it was absolutely rich and mind-blowing, and each one of paragraphs and sentences was a whole topic to discuss and opening up a lot of reflection for me personally. So thank you very much. I will come back to this material in the next few days to go through everything. Very, very rich. Yes.
Yeah.
And we
luckily
carry, yeah.
we have
This week we go
recording.
on
Yeah,
with that. Yes, we will put this material on the website so that, yeah, everyone who feels the need to go back and re-listen and re-elaborate, it will be there. And we carry on talking about care with the session Raising Care, which is on the 5th, on Thursday. And yes, the interesting thing is that really these courses is really intertwining and nourishing from the philosophical, theoretical point of view to the reality of the practices, and things are really, yeah, very, very connected. This is a very particular moment. Like, I only personally can briefly say at the end of this discussion that what was coming back to my mind is that I personally went through a phase of absolutely enthusiasm, seeing this massive challenge and like something that will trigger change. We are forced to face it. There's no other option on the one side. But this was my very first reaction, like the very first 4 months of confinement. And after that, the realizing that it's a long distance run is really affecting as an artist. For example, my space of erotic eros in terms of also of creation, like the effort that we need to make to respond to this level of change is really massive and has an impact. So like in the case of mourning, we really need to go through a phase of mourning I think I personally need to go through like the change is so massive, so important, that I feel the need, even, you know, in a way, to let go and surrender before recuperating the energies to respond to the change. So for me, even if I'm speaking personally as an individual, but also what I can witness in terms of collectives, like I am part of a common, like a cultural common. We really need a time. Like, I see that physiologically, even those communities that they are practicing alternatives to capitalism acceleration are challenged by the acceleration of the problem that we need to face. So even the slowness of Agamben new forms of life, which is a different speed to inhabit our bodies and communities, which is the ethical one, is challenged even in our spaces, because the impact of the speed of the virus, this virus has even a very symbolic and particularly performative speed in the contagion. So it's in a way to fight against the accelerating spiral of capitalism. We are challenged to in a way play the same game, because this virus goes past, and in the way we respond with solidarity, in the way we respond with creation, it's challenging our natural speed, and
Yeah,
this is something.
thank you. I will just add that yes, you are absolutely right. But what is really important, that mourning, if you look at the book by Derrida, it's not simply like you are sitting and crying on somebody's deathbed, but it's some kind of intonation. You know, it's like you shift your movements, your way of voice. So it's a little bit shifting the whole choreography of the collectivity of the body practice. So it's some kind of another attitude to how you emit words, because you can speak like this, but you can speak differently, like Kierkegaard's title, Strach et Trepet, fear and trembling, like, and the same you can say, I would answer to Olga concerning the clinic. So clinic is not only the lazaret where there are people who are patients, but it is also approach, you know. So it is also some kind of all-encompassing approach to the political potentialities. And we have to face this situation that the critique of metaphysics and the critique of humanism brought us to this new dimension when universe is superseded by clinic. And we are now at this universal clinic per se. So we have to be aware of this condition. Yeah. So thank you very much, Gabriela.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Looking forward.
Yeah, we can
looking forward. Yes. Thank
So,
you for taking your time with us. Thank you so much.
yeah, we continue our struggle. Yeah, and thanks so much, and please join our next iteration. Yeah, thank you, and apologize for that attack.
Thank you, Dmitry.
It was really kind of.
And thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel.
It's okay.
Yeah, yeah. Ciao, Daphne. Bye, bye.